never die ahead of time.
Dr. Tony Evans says the fact that our days are numbered shouldn't be as scary as some people think it is.
When you're in the light, when you know you're in God's will, it automatically curbs the fear of death.
This is The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans, author, speaker, senior pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship in Dallas, Texas, and president of the Urban Alternative. Today, Dr. Evans tackles the final challenge we'll all face in this life, the end of it. Let's join him as he talks about the Christian view of death, and he puts some of our needless fears to rest.
John 11 is the climactic event in the life of Christ, the raising of Lazarus from the dead. No other event captures the deity of Christ like this one. It is so stupendous in its event as well as in its principles that it covers this whole chapter from beginning to end. The first thing we find out is that the authority of Christ gives meaning and purpose to death. When we open up chapter 11, we discover that we're dealing with a family, two sisters and a brother. It's Martha, it's Mary, and it's Lazarus. We're told in verse 2 that Lazarus has been extremely ill, and that the word goes to him from his sisters, which says, Lord, behold, he who you love is sick. The point being, hurry up and get here. You notice that they appeal to the love of Christ. The one whom you love is sick. So we have a very close bond here, in desperate need of a solution, in desperate need of Christ. Now, that ought to teach us something off the bat, and that is that being loved by Christ doesn't negate being sick. Lazarus is very much loved and is very, very sick. So simply because you belong to Christ doesn't mean you don't get sick. Because if it meant that, then you wouldn't even die. No, he loves Lazarus, but Lazarus is still sick. So people close to Christ do get sick. In the midst of that, we're given a very confusing statement in verse 6. When therefore he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed then 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now that's not what you would expect to read. You would expect to read, when he heard that his good friend who he loved, Lazarus, was sick, he made a beeline to get to him as soon as possible. You see that when he heard his friend Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 days, and it was during that time that Lazarus died. What kind of friend is that? Martha says in verse 21, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary says the same thing in verse 32, the middle of the verse, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. In other words, they were saying, hurry up, Jesus, come here, my brother is sick. If you get here soon enough, you can keep him from dying. Instead, Jesus says, I'm not going now. What's the point? Death, when it's properly related to God, is used by God to fulfill his sovereign purposes. It's not an event that has no rhyme or reason to. It's a horrible event. But it can be made an event that has meaning when placed in the hands of Christ. They put the problem into his hands. Lazarus is sick. Jesus makes a sovereign decision, which is not the one they wanted, because he had a bigger agenda at work. Let's look at some of the benefits of this agenda. Number 1, verse 4, says, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. So God uses sickness, and yes, even death, to magnify himself in a way that he would not have been magnified if the sickness and death did not occur. Not only that, he goes on to point out in verse 15 that God allows sickness to increase the faith of his children. Verse 15, and I am glad for your sake that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Verse 40, Jesus said to her, did not I say unto you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So another reason that God allows children to get sick is to place them in a situation where they have to trust him in a way that they didn't have to trust him before. So he does it for his own glory. He does it to increase our faith in a crisis and let us see how he can come through in the most difficult of circumstances. He also does it in order to get people saved. Look at what he says in verse 42. And I know, and I knew that that you hear me always, and because of the people standing around, I said, that they may believe that you did send me. Verse 45. Many therefore of the Jews who had come to Mary and beheld what he had done believed in him. In other words, people got saved. So God used the circumstances surrounding Lazarus to bring non-Christians into the family of God. Secondly, the authority of Christ not only gives meaning to death, it overcomes the fear of death. Verse 8. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews are now seeking to stone you. Are you going there again? You can't go back there. They're going to kill you. Look at what Jesus says. Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. They warn Jesus, don't go, because they're after your life. He says, wait a minute. There are 12 hours of daylight. I can go out in the daylight because I can see where I'm going. But if I stay in the darkness, I can't see, so I don't know where I'm going. Now, what did he mean by that? When the Bible talks about being in the light, it means being in the light of God's will. What Jesus was saying was, when you're in the will of God, you're in the daylight. When you're out of the will of God, you're in darkness. So if you are in the will of God, it doesn't matter who's waiting for you back there. They can't touch you unless God says touch you. If you're out of the will of God, it doesn't matter where you stay. Because if you're out of the will of God, you're not safe. Safety, he tells the disciples, is walking in the daylight. Walking in the daylight is walking in the will of God. So if you really want to be safe, don't worry about who stones you. Worry about whose light you're in. Because if you're in God's light and he says nothing's supposed to happen to you, the stones can't touch you. If you're outside of God's light, thinking that you're safe, stones not even meant for you may ricochet off you. The idea here is that only safety can be found in the will of God. Jesus says, I'm not going to fear death, them stoning me, because I know going back there is God's will. And since I know that is God's will, I know I am in his protective custody. Safety is only to be found in the light. So your question, the question that you face today, is are you in the will of God? Because that determines how safe you are. The authority of Christ clarifies then what death really is all about, what it means. Let's look down at verse 20. Martha, therefore, when she had heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary was still in the house. Now, these two sisters, Martha is kind of the aggressive one. Mary is sort of the passive one. She runs out. Martha says, Lord, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Jesus says, your brother shall rise again in verse 23. Martha responds, well, I know he will rise again on the resurrection day. Jesus responds, no, you don't get it, girl. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live, even if he dies. Now get verse 26. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Now that just answers all your concerns right there. He who believes in me shall never die. Get that word never. Shall never, ever die. Anyone who fears death fears something, if you know Jesus Christ, that will never, ever occur to you. So Martha then wanted to see Lazarus triumph over death. And Jesus comes along and says, then it's not a program. I am the resurrection and the life. Now this is very important. If you want to conquer your fear of death, if you indeed have one, or if you never want to get one, it will not be based on the programs you're involved with. It will be based on the relationship with Christ you develop. I am the resurrection and the life. This is a personal thing. The closer you are to Christ, the fewer fears you have. The further you are from Christ, the more fears that you have. So if you're a chronic worrier, that, unless there's something physically wrong, that's a spiritual problem. Because if you're a chronic worrier, you just worry when you're not worrying. You see, you worry about what's next to be worried about. If you're a chronic worrier, what that suggests is that you don't understand who Christ is. Because the closer you get to Christ, the closer his assurances become your assurances, and therefore the more your fears dwindle. Okay? Worry is like a rocking chair. It keeps you moving. It just doesn't take you anywhere. And so it is when our intimacy with Christ is not as it ought to be, we're going to worry about things that we really don't have to worry about. And that's why Satan wants to keep you from being intimate with Christ. He wants to keep you involved in programs so that you don't develop relationships. And we can do this in our families. You can do the programs of marriage without having the intimacy of marriage. What God never wants the intimacy to be lost to the program. Okay? And so he says, I am the resurrection and the life, which leads to another point. That Christ's authority gives comfort during times of death. Notice what happens in verse 31. The Jews then, who were with her, with Mary in the house, they were consoling her. When they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, she ran to Christ, followed her, supposing she was on her way to the tomb. And they went to weep with her. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Jesus therefore saw her weeping, saw her crying, and the Jews who came with her also weeping. He was deeply troubled, moved in spirit, and said, where have you laid him? And they said, Lord, come and see. And then we have the shortest verse in the Bible, verse 35, Jesus wept. There are three reasons why Jesus wept. Reason number one, Mary, whom he loved, was hurting. It says when he saw Mary weeping. Okay? Now, why is that important? This is the most important thing I can tell you. The Bible says in Hebrews 4 that Jesus is touched with our pain. When tears come down your eyes, water wells up in his right now. Why? Because he is a man. He is totally God, but he is the God-man. God the Father has never experientially felt your pain because he's a spirit. But God the Son knows your pain because he is not only deity, he is humanity. And because he's humanity, when you cry, he cries. And that's why he invites us, what? To come to the throne of grace, Hebrews 4 says, and tell him when you hurt. Because when you hurt, he feels it. Now that's wonderful to know that somebody feels it who can also do something about it. See, a lot of us comfort each other. We can comfort, but we can't help. Jesus can comfort and help. So he says, bring them to me and let me cry with you. And so he has an invitation to prayer and bringing your pain and your tears and your honesty and your hurts and your struggles and your stresses and your strains to Jesus Christ and let him participate with you in them.
Well, Dr. Evans will come back with more of our message in just a moment. First, though, today's lesson will wrap up Tony's current series called The Authority of Christ, an 8-part look at how the power of the Lord trumps any trial that might come your way, anything from disaster to disease, and as we're learning today, death. It's powerful material that'll help you make it through the hard times. And that's why we're making it available for the last time today as our gift in appreciation for your contribution of any amount, large or small, to help us keep Tony's teaching on this station. Just visit tonyevans.org, make your donation online, and let us send you the Authority of Christ series. Again, that's tonyevans.org, or call us at 1-800-800-3222, where members of our resource team are available around the clock to help you. Again, 1-800-800-3222. Well, right now, Dr. Evans is back with more of today's lesson.
There are three reasons why Jesus wept. Reason number one, Mary, whom he loved, was hurting. There's a second reason he cries. Lazarus was a friend. He loved Lazarus. So he felt the human loss. The Bible does not say that Christians don't sorrow. The Bible simply says we don't sorrow like others who have no hope. We have hopeful sorrow, not hopeless sorrow. There is a third reason why he's in pain, in weeping, and that is because of why they are crying. Lazarus died. Death is no friend. Death is only here because of sin. That's why when God removes sin, it automatically removes death. But because of the tyranny of Satan, because the Bible says that he seeks to kill and destroy, whenever someone dies, it is a reflection of his activity in the world to destroy that which God has given life to. Jesus weeps because of the effects of sin, which can take even good people 6 feet under. The effects of sin that grows us old, something we will never experience in eternity. The effects of sin that debilitates our bodies, that brings on diseases that no medicine can heal, that causes Jesus pain. But even though it caused him pain, he still delayed 2 days because pain never overrides God's plan. Like when you're spanking your kids. It's painful, but you got to keep going. All right? You may hurt more than they do, but it's still necessary in order to carry out the maturity process. So it is with God. He may not come and solve your pain because of a bigger plan, but he will empathize with your pain, walk with you through your pain, comfort you in your pain, and that is why to go to the garden, as the song says, is so critical. So he empathizes with them. He weeps with them. Which leads to one final point. The authority of Christ overcomes the reality of death. Jesus, having been moved in his spirit, having wept with them, says in verse 39, remove the stone. Now Martha is the pragmatist. Martha says, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Now that's true. If you're dead 4 days and rigor mortis is set in and you're not embalmed, you're just buried, there's going to be a stench. So she's very practical. And you can be practical till you deal with Jesus. You know? Sometimes I hate practical people. Some people you be around, you tell them what God can do, and they say, but yeah, he can do that, but let's get practical. I don't want to be practical. I want to be supernatural. And I want to know what God is supernaturally able to do. Not only what's practical. She comes up with a practical, it's practical that after 4 days, the body stinks. That's right. The only problem is Jesus is in the house. And so Jesus shows up and says, remove the stone. And says to her, by way of convicting her, did not I say to you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God? See, you're looking at a program, and I'm talking about a person. Now, she could have argued, but nobody has ever seen this before. Or she could have argued, but this has not happened before. But Jesus said, no, but what did I say? I told you that if you believed me, you would see a miracle. And you would see the glory of God more than a miracle. A miracle is where God supersedes his own law. Laws are regular. Things are, you get old, you wither, you die. That's a law. That's normal. But God every now and then will intervene into normality and do a miracle, which means he flips his laws and no longer operates by them. And he only does that when there is a bigger point to be made. Verse 43, they're all there. He cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. Theologian Augustine said he had to say Lazarus, because if he would have just said come forth, everybody would have got up. He says in verse 43, Lazarus, come forth. And verse 44 says, he who had died came forth. This is not resuscitation. This is resurrection. He who had died, using our own human language, came forth. So whatever went wrong during the 4 days he was in there got right quick. And he came forth. But we got a problem. He didn't really walk forth, he waddled forth. Now we know he waddled forth and not walked forth because it says he was bound, verse 44, hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. So like a mummy would be wrapped, that's how they did it in those days. So he's kind of wrapped and his hands are tied and his feet are tied, so he's kind of waddling forth. Okay? All right? So you got what you call, the night of the living dead here. I mean, this guy is moving out here still with his grave clothes on. So we got something good and we got something bad. What we have good is he's alive. What we've got bad is he's bound. There's no freedom. There's no liberty. He can't enjoy the life he has because he's all wrapped up in death cloth. The cloth of death is encasing him even though he's received the source of life. So he waddles forth. Then Jesus speaks again. He says in verse 44, unbound him and let him go. Unbound him and let him go. This was very critical. Stick with me here. Jesus says Lazarus comes forth. He comes forth bound. He then turns to his sisters or some of the people there and says, now you folks go loose him and let him go. Jesus raises him, but Jesus doesn't loose him. Jesus brings him out of the grave, but he doesn't take the grave off of him. Jesus gets him up and going, but people have to intervene in order to allow him to fully enjoy the new life that he has. And a lot of us are like that. We've been raised to new life in Jesus Christ, still waddling around with our old grave clothes on. We've been given new life in Jesus Christ, wrapped in the old cloth of the world. We've been given new life in Jesus Christ, still wrapped in the thinking, acting, talking, and walking of the old life. No wonder we're waddling in our spiritual life and can't get up and run the Christian race, because we're still wrapped up with that old life that we should have left behind. But let me tell you something. Lazarus was so wrapped up, he couldn't even unwrap himself. He was so tied up. I mean, they had tied so much of this stuff around him that he needed somebody else to loose him and let him go. If you're wrapped up, not enjoying your Christian life, if you're walking like a dead man, even though you have the life of Christ, you need to get around some spiritual Christians that know how to unwrap you so that you can fully participate in all the rights and privileges that come with knowing Jesus Christ. The spiritual principle is clear. Paul says, take off the old and put on the new. He says, let the old go and allow yourself to be free to be all that God has raised you to be. What good is it if God has saved you and you're still living in Laurel Land? What good is it if God has saved you and you're still making your world in the graveyard? You need to make sure that you let the old life unwrap from you so that you can be a full, enjoying participant of the new life that you have in Jesus Christ. Martha saw no way. Jesus said the glory of God. So what am I saying? I'm saying God can take death and put meaning in it. God can overpower its fear. He can show you a real definition of it so that as a result, you can be comforted during it with the final outcome that he can overcome it. That's the Christ we're dealing with. Now, this only makes sense if you know Christ. If you're a Christian, this is the only way it works. In order to get over the fear of it, you have to be a walking in the will of God Christian. There must be intimacy with a person, not just church participation in the program. The greatest need in all of our lives is for the forgiveness of sins. And there's only one person who can do that. That's Jesus Christ. That's why he died on the cross and rose from the dead. And he offers forgiveness of sins. If you're carrying guilt for what you've done, fear for what you've done, Jesus Christ is right here, right now. If you go to him, confess your sinfulness to him, and trust him to forgive you, he will do it on the spot and also grant you eternal life.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Evans. Find out more about what it means to come to Christ and start living a brand new life. Visit TonyEvans.org today and click on the link at the top that just says Jesus. Tony will take you through everything you need to know and connect you with some free resources to get you started. And he'll come back in a moment with more about why that choice to follow Christ is so important. So stay with us. First, though, don't miss out on your last chance to get all 8 full-length lessons in Tony's current series, The Authority of Christ, as our gift. Remember, if we hear from you by the end of the day today, we'll send you this CD collection as our thank you gift for any contribution you can make to help support the alternative, large or small. Just visit TonyEvans.org before the day's out to get the details and make the arrangements. That's TonyEvans.org. Or call us at 1-800-800-3222 and let one of our staff members help you. 1-800-800-3222. Every person who's ever lived has eventually crossed over into death. Only one has ever crossed back. Next time, Dr. Evans will talk to us about the validity, value, and victory of the resurrection. Right now, though, he's back with a final thought for today.
Donald Gray Barnhouse, the great preacher from long ago, had lost his first wife to death, and he was on his way home from the funeral, and his sons were in the back seat, and they said, "Dad, why did Mom have to die?" He couldn't come up with a good answer. It was a real struggle. Of course, it's natural to have a struggle at a time like that. He stopped at a red light, waiting for it to change. While he was stopped, a big truck came through the other part of the intersection, blocking out the sun, casting a shadow over his car. It dawned on him that God had just given him a great illustration to give his children. He turned to the back seat and he said, "Would you rather be hit by the truck or by its shadow?" They said, "Well, Dad, by the shadow." Right. Because the shadow is dark, but it really doesn't hurt you. He said, "Son, it's like that. When you know Jesus Christ and death hits, you're hit by the shadow. It gets gloomy, but it doesn't hurt you. But son, if you die without Jesus Christ, you're hit by the truck." Now, nobody in here knows when they're going to die. My prayer for all of us is that we will live long, happy, fruitful, productive, God-glorifying lives. But if you walked outside today and something went wrong, no matter how careful you drive, no matter how healthy you feel, well, you have been hit by the shadow, or you have been hit by the truck. You see, if you die without Jesus Christ, you die. You die. Not in the sense that you don't exist anymore, in the sense that your existence has no meaning, no purpose, only pain. When you die in Jesus Christ, you have existence as it was meant to be when God created your forefather Adam. Eternal life. Because those who believe in me shall never die. If you died today, would you be hit by the shadow? Or would you be hit by the truck?
The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans is brought to you by the Urban Alternative and is made possible by the generous contributions of listeners like you.